The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Prince Adrian walked through the corridors he had known since childhood. At 35, he carried himself with the practiced grace expected of royalty, but those who looked closely might notice the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. Adrian paused before a towering window that overlooked the palace gardens. Beyond the perfectly manicured lawns and rose bushes, he could see the distant city of Valorian, where millions of citizens went about their daily lives. They saw him as their future king, a symbol of stability and tradition. If only they knew the truth about what happened behind these gilded walls. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. His younger sister, Princess Isabel, appeared at the end of the hallway. Even from a distance, Adrian could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way she moved with careful deliberation, as if each step required enormous effort. "Belle," he called softly, using the childhood nickname that still felt natural despite their royal protocols. "How are you feeling today?" Isabel managed a weak smile as she approached. At 28, she had always been the more spirited of the royal siblings, quick to laugh and unafraid to challenge convention. But that version of his sister seemed to have disappeared months ago, replaced by this fragile shadow. "I'm fine, Adrian," she replied, the practiced response they had all learned to give. "Just tired." Adrian studied her face, noting the way she avoided his gaze. The word "fine" had become a shield in their family. A way to deflect concern and maintain the appearance that everything was perfect within the House of Ravencrest. But Adrian knew better. He had watched his sister struggle with something she couldn't name, something that had slowly drained the light from her eyes. "Have you spoken to anyone about what?" Isabel's voice carried a sharp edge that hadn't been there before. "There's nothing to speak about. I'm handling my responsibilities perfectly well." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their mother, Queen Evangeline. She glided toward them with the effortless elegance that had made her a beloved figure both within the kingdom and internationally. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her expression composed, but Adrian had learned to read the subtle signs of stress in her bearing. "Adrian." "Isabel." She acknowledged them with a slight nod. "Your father is waiting for you in the Blue Room. We need to discuss the upcoming state visit." As they walked together toward the meeting, Queen Evangeline maintained her serene facade. But Adrian caught the worried glance she cast toward Isabel. The royal family had perfected the art of silent communication over the years, entire conversations conducted through meaningful looks and carefully modulated tones. The Blue Room had served as an informal meeting space for the royal family for generations. Its walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to watch over every discussion. King Maximilian sat at the head of the polished oak table, his presence commanding even in casual moments. At 62, the king remained an imposing figure, his military background evident in his straight posture and decisive movements. But Adrian had noticed changes in recent years. The way his father's hands sometimes trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The moments of confusion that passed quickly but left everyone pretending they hadn't happened. "The delegation from Astoria arrives next week," King Maximilian began without preamble. "Isabel, you'll be hosting the cultural events. Adrian, you'll join me for the formal negotiations." Isabel shifted in her chair. "Father, perhaps someone else could handle the cultural events. I don't think I'm—" "Nonsense," the king cut her off firmly. "You're perfectly capable. This is what we do, Isabel. This is our duty." The word hung in the air like a weight. Duty. It had been the cornerstone of Adrian's education. The answer to every question about purpose and meaning. When personal desires conflicted with royal obligations, duty won. When family members struggled, duty demanded they carry on regardless. Adrian watched his sister's face crumble slightly before she composed herself. He wanted to speak up, to suggest that maybe Isabel needed support rather than additional responsibilities, but the weight of protocol and family expectations kept him silent. After the meeting, Adrian found himself alone with his father in the king's private study. The room smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, filled with books and artifacts collected over decades of royal duties. It was here, away from the formal spaces of the palace, that the most honest conversations sometimes happened. "You're concerned about your sister," King Maximilian observed without looking up from the documents he was reviewing. "Yes, I am," Adrian replied carefully. "She's been struggling lately, and I think she might benefit from talking to someone professionally." The king's pen stopped moving. He looked up with an expression that mixed frustration with something that might have been fear. "We don't air our personal difficulties in public, Adrian. You know this. I'm not suggesting anything public, just someone qualified to help her work through whatever she's dealing with. Isabel is fine. She's going through a difficult period, as we all do sometimes, but she's strong. She comes from good stock." The king's voice carried the tone that indicated the conversation was over. Adrian felt the familiar frustration that came with these interactions. His father genuinely believed that willpower and royal breeding were sufficient to overcome any personal struggle. The concept that mental health might require professional attention was foreign to him, possibly even threatening. "Father, what if she's not fine? What if continuing to pretend everything is perfect is actually making things worse?" King Maximilian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This family has weathered centuries of challenges, Adrian. We've survived wars, economic crises, and political upheavals. We did not survive by dwelling on personal difficulties or seeking outside help for every momentary weakness." The words stung, partly because Adrian understood the logic behind them. The royal family had indeed survived countless challenges by maintaining a united front, by never showing vulnerability to their subjects or the international community. But at what cost? That evening, Adrian found Isabel in the palace garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath a centuries-old oak tree. The setting sun painted everything in golden hues, creating an almost magical atmosphere that seemed at odds with the heavy mood that had settled over the family. "I used to love coming here as a child," Isabel said quietly as Adrian approached. "Remember how we used to climb this tree? Mother would be furious when she found us with dirt on our clothes." Adrian smiled at the memory. "You were always the better climber. I was too worried about falling." "Maybe I should have worried more about falling," Isabel replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian sat beside her, choosing his words carefully. "Belle, I want you to know that you can talk to me about anything. Not as the heir to the throne, not as your older brother who's supposed to have all the answers, but just as someone who loves you." For a moment, Isabel's carefully maintained composure wavered. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "What if talking doesn't help? What if there's something fundamentally wrong with me that can't be fixed?" The vulnerability in her voice broke Adrian's heart. "There's nothing wrong with you that can't be helped with the right support." "Father doesn't see it that way. Neither does Mother, really. They think I just need to try harder, to focus more on my duties and less on my feelings." Adrian had heard similar sentiments expressed by their parents countless times. The royal mindset seemed to view emotions as luxuries that interfered with proper functioning. Feel sad? Focus on your responsibilities. Feel anxious? Remember your duty to the kingdom. Feel lost? Look to your royal heritage for guidance. "What do you think?" Adrian asked. "Not what they think. Not what the protocols suggest, but what do you think you need?" Isabel was quiet for so long that Adrian wondered if she would answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with exhaustion. I think I need help. Real help from someone who understands these things. I think I've been drowning for months, and I'm tired of pretending I'm swimming." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Seeking help would mean acknowledging that the royal approach to personal difficulties might be insufficient. It would mean potentially exposing the family to scrutiny and criticism. "I've been thinking the same thing," Adrian said finally. "Not just about you, but about all of us. Father's memory issues, mother's anxiety about maintaining our public image, my own struggles with the pressure of everything that's expected." Isabel turned to look at him with surprise. "You struggle with the pressure?" Adrian laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Every day. I wake up knowing that millions of people are counting on me to be perfect, to never make mistakes, to somehow embody all their hopes for the future. Some days I can barely decide what to have for breakfast, let alone how to guide a nation." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the palace walls. For the first time in months, Adrian felt the relief that came with honest conversation. He realized how isolated they had all become, each struggling privately while maintaining perfect public faces. "What if we did something radical?" Adrian asked suddenly. "Like what? What if we actually talked about these things? What if we acknowledged that being royal doesn't make us immune to human difficulties?" Isabel's eyes widened. "Father would never allow it." "Maybe Father doesn't get to decide everything," Adrian replied, surprising himself with his boldness. "Maybe it's time for our family to evolve, to find ways to honor our traditions while also taking care of our actual well-being." The idea felt both terrifying and liberating. For generations, the House of Ravencrest had maintained power partly through the illusion of perfection. Royal families were supposed to be above the common struggles that affected ordinary citizens. They were symbols of stability and strength, not examples of human vulnerability. But Adrian was beginning to wonder if that approach had outlived its usefulness. The world had changed dramatically in recent decades. People were more aware of mental health issues, more willing to discuss personal struggles, more skeptical of institutions that seemed disconnected from real human experience. As they walked back toward the palace, Isabel suddenly stopped. "Adrian, if you ever did decide to speak publicly about any of this, I want you to know that you'd have my support." The statement was both a gift and a challenge. Adrian realized that his sister was looking to him not just as her older brother, but as the future king who might have the power to change how their family approached these issues. Later that night, Adrian lay awake in his ornate bedroom, staring at the ceiling that had been painted by master artists 3 centuries earlier. Every detail of his life was steeped in history and tradition, connected to a legacy that stretched back generations. But he was beginning to understand that honoring that legacy might require changing it. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Adrian was summoned to his father's study, where King Maximilian sat with a collection of newspapers and tablets spread across his desk. The headlines were brutal. Princess Isabel's mysterious absence sparks speculation. Royal family under scrutiny as Princess misses third public event. What's really happening behind palace walls? "They're starting to notice," the king said grimly. "Isabel's been absent from too many events. People are asking questions." Adrian picked up one of the newspapers, scanning the speculative articles that ranged from romantic scandals to serious illness. None of them came close to the truth, but they all shared a common theme. Something was wrong within the royal family, and the public deserved answers. "What do we do?" Adrian asked. King Maximilian's expression hardened. "We do what this family has always done. We present a united front. We fulfill our duties, and we weather the storm. Isabel will resume her public schedule immediately." "Father, she's not ready for that. Forcing her back into the spotlight right now could make everything worse." And allowing the speculation to continue will destroy our credibility, the king replied sharply. The monarchy depends on public trust, Adrian. If people lose faith in our ability to manage our own affairs, they'll lose faith in our ability to lead the nation. Adrian realized they had reached a crossroads. The traditional royal approach demanded that personal struggles be hidden, that duty supersede individual well-being, that the institution be protected at all costs. But he was increasingly convinced that this approach was not only harmful to his family, but ultimately counterproductive for the monarchy itself. As he left his father's study, Adrian made a decision that would change the course of his life and potentially the future of the royal family. It was time to consider doing something that no member of the House of Ravencrest had ever done before: telling the truth about their struggles and asking for help in public. The weight of this possibility both terrified and energized him. Adrian understood that speaking honestly about his family's difficulties would violate centuries of royal protocol and potentially expose them to unprecedented scrutiny and criticism. But he was beginning to believe that the alternative, continuing to suffer in silence while their problems worsened, might be even more dangerous. That afternoon, Adrian made a call that would set everything in motion. He contacted Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a respected psychologist who specialized in working with public figures and understanding the unique pressures they faced. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something much larger. As he waited for Dr. Mitchell to arrive for their confidential consultation, Adrian looked out once again at the city of Valorian spreading beneath the palace walls. Soon he might have to choose between protecting his family's privacy and protecting their well-being. The decision would require courage he wasn't sure he possessed, but he was beginning to understand that some choices couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The phone call with Dr. Mitchell had been brief, but illuminating. She had listened to his concerns about Isabel without judgment, offering insights that resonated deeply with his own observations. More importantly, she had suggested that seeking help was not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom, not a betrayal of royal duty, but a fulfillment of it. Your responsibility as future king includes taking care of your own well-being and that of your family, she had said. You cannot serve your people effectively if you're struggling with unaddressed personal issues. The perspective was revolutionary in the context of Adrian's upbringing, but it made intuitive sense. How could he provide leadership and stability for an entire nation if his own family was falling apart behind closed doors? As the sun set over Ravencrest Palace once again, Adrian found himself standing in the same spot where he had begun this day, looking out at the gardens and the city beyond. But everything had changed. The decision he was contemplating would either mark the beginning of a new chapter for the royal family or the beginning of the end of everything they had worked to preserve. Either way, Adrian was beginning to understand that the status quo was no longer sustainable. Change was coming, whether they initiated it themselves or whether it was forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. The only question was whether they would have the courage to shape that change rather than simply enduring it. The private consultation with Dr. Mitchell took place in a discreet office across the city, far from the watchful eyes of palace staff and royal photographers. Adrian had traveled there in an unmarked car, wearing casual clothes that made him nearly unrecognizable to passers-by. For the first time in years, he felt the strange freedom of anonymity. Dr. Mitchell was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a direct manner that put Adrian immediately at ease. Her office was comfortable but not luxurious, filled with books and plants rather than the formal grandeur he was accustomed to. It was a space designed for honest conversation rather than ceremony. "Tell me about your family's current situation," she said simply, settling into her chair with a notepad that remained largely untouched throughout their conversation. Adrian found himself speaking more openly than he had in years. He described Isabel's gradual withdrawal from life, His father's increasing episodes of confusion, his mother's desperate attempts to maintain normalcy while privately falling apart. He talked about the crushing weight of expectations, the isolation that came with royal duty, and his growing certainty that their traditional approaches to dealing with problems were failing. "What you're describing sounds like a family in crisis," Dr. Mitchell observed, "and yet you're all expected to continue performing your public roles as if nothing is wrong." "That's how it's always been done," Adrian replied, then immediately questioned his own words. "But maybe that's the problem." Dr. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "What would happen if you continued on this path without addressing these issues?" The question hung in the air as Adrian contemplated scenarios he had been trying to avoid thinking about. Isabel's condition could worsen to the point where she might not be able to function at all. His father's memory issues might become impossible to hide from the public. The stress could destroy his mother's health, and Adrian himself might crack under the pressure of pretending everything was fine while his family disintegrated around him. "It would be catastrophic," he admitted, "not just for us personally, but for the monarchy itself." "And what would happen if you sought help publicly?" This was the question that had been keeping Adrian awake at night. Public acknowledgement of their struggles would violate every protocol he had been raised to follow. It would expose the royal family to unprecedented scrutiny and potentially damage the institution they had spent their lives protecting. "I honestly don't know," Adrian said. "It's never been done before. Not like this." Dr. Mitchell smiled gently. "That doesn't necessarily mean it shouldn't be done. Sometimes being the first to do something requires tremendous courage, but it also creates opportunities for positive change that wouldn't otherwise exist." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, during which Adrian felt layers of royal conditioning being peeled away to reveal concerns and hopes he had barely acknowledged to himself. Dr. Mitchell didn't offer simple solutions or easy answers, but she provided something more valuable: validation that his instincts about needing change were correct. As Adrian prepared to leave, Dr. Mitchell made an observation that would stay with him for days afterward. "Prince Adrian, you have an opportunity to redefine what royal leadership looks like in the modern world. Instead of ruling through the illusion of perfection, you could lead through the demonstration of wisdom, compassion, and genuine humanity." The drive back to the palace gave Adrian time to process their conversation. The city streets were busy with ordinary people living their ordinary lives, dealing with their own struggles and challenges, without the additional burden of public scrutiny. Adrian envied them their privacy, but he was beginning to understand that his visibility could also be a tool for good. When he arrived at Ravencrest Palace, Adrian found the atmosphere even more tense than when he had left. His mother met him in the entrance hall, her usually perfect composure showing cracks. "Adrian, thank goodness you're back," Queen Evangeline said, her voice strained. "Your father has called an emergency meeting. The situation with the media has escalated." The royal family gathered once again in the Blue Room, but this time the mood was markedly different. King Maximilian looked exhausted, his military bearing unable to completely mask his frustration. Isabel sat quietly in her chair, seeming smaller and more fragile than Adrian had ever seen her. "The speculation is getting out of control," the king announced without preamble. 3 major news outlets have published articles questioning Isabel's fitness for royal duties. The Prime Minister has called to express concern about the political implications. Adrian felt a surge of anger at the idea that his sister's personal struggles were being reduced to political calculations. "What specifically are they saying?" Queen Evangeline handed him a tablet with several news articles already loaded. The headlines were even worse than those from the previous day. "Is Princess Isabel mentally unstable? Royal family crisis. What are they hiding? The future of the monarchy in question. They're demanding answers. King Maximilian continued. The palace communications office has been fielding dozens of requests for statements, interviews, medical reports. They want to know everything. Isabel finally spoke, her voice barely audible. Maybe we should tell them. The room fell silent. King Maximilian stared at his daughter as if she had suggested abdication. Queen Evangeline's face went pale. Tell them what, exactly? The king asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The truth, Isabel replied, raising her eyes to meet her father's gaze. That I'm struggling with depression and anxiety, that I'm getting help. That being royal doesn't make me immune to mental health challenges. Absolutely not, King Maximilian said firmly. We will not dignify these intrusions with personal revelations. The monarchy's strength comes from its dignity and reserve. The moment we start sharing our private difficulties with the public, we become just another family with problems instead of a symbol of stability and continuity. Adrian watched his sister's face crumple at their father's words. He realized that this moment represented everything that was wrong with their current approach. Isabel was in pain. She needed support. And instead of receiving understanding from her family, she was being told that her suffering was less important than maintaining their public image. Father, Adrian said carefully, what if our dignity comes not from hiding our struggles, but from how we handle them? The king turned his sharp gaze toward his son. What are you suggesting? Adrian took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything. I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to consider a different approach. What if we acknowledge that we're human beings with human challenges, and that seeking help when needed is actually a sign of strength rather than weakness? You want us to bare our souls to tabloid journalists? Queen Evangeline asked, her voice rising with distress. I want us to tell our own story before others tell it for us, Adrian replied. I want to show people that royalty can coexist with authenticity, that leadership includes taking care of mental health, and that asking for help is not a failure of duty, but a fulfillment of it. King Maximilian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the room. This conversation is over. Isabel will resume her public duties immediately. We will issue a statement saying she was dealing with a minor illness and is now fully recovered. The matter is closed. As the king left the room, Adrian felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. His father's approach would require Isabel to return to public events while she was still struggling, to smile and wave and pretend everything was perfect while she was barely holding herself together. It would mean continuing to live a lie that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. That evening, Adrian found himself walking through the palace halls long after most of the staff had gone home. The vast building felt like a beautiful prison, filled with centuries of tradition, but also centuries of secrets. He passed portraits of his ancestors, wondering how many of them had faced similar moments of choice between personal truth and institutional preservation. He ended up in the palace library, a massive room filled with thousands of books collected by generations of royal readers. It was here, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, that Adrian began to research what other royal families had done when faced with personal crises. The examples were few and often cautionary. Royal family members who had spoken openly about personal struggles were typically viewed as having brought shame upon their institutions. But Adrian also found more recent examples of public figures who had been praised for their honesty about mental health challenges, who had helped reduce stigma and encourage others to seek help. The key difference, Adrian realized, was context and approach. Those who had been successful in speaking openly about personal struggles had done so thoughtfully, with clear purposes and positive messages. They had framed their difficulties not as failures, but as part of the human experience, and their recovery efforts as examples of resilience and wisdom. Adrian spent hours reading and thinking, gradually forming an idea that was both terrifying and exhilarating. What if he could find a way to speak honestly about his family's struggles while also demonstrating the values that the monarchy was supposed to represent? What if vulnerability and strength could coexist in royal leadership? The next morning brought another crisis. Isabel failed to appear for breakfast, and when staff checked her room, they found her in a state that clearly required immediate medical attention. She wasn't in physical danger, but her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she was unable to function. Dr. Harrison, the royal family's physician, was summoned immediately. After examining Isabel, he spoke privately with her parents and Adrian. His assessment was blunt and concerning. "Princess Isabel is experiencing a severe depressive episode," he explained. "She needs immediate professional help from a mental health specialist, not just medical monitoring. This situation has progressed beyond what can be managed with willpower and royal duty." King Maximilian's face was grim. "How long before she can resume her public schedule?" Dr. Harrison looked incredulous. "Your Majesty, with respect, Princess Isabel's public schedule should be the least of our concerns right now. She needs intensive therapy and possibly medication. Recovery from this level of depression typically takes months, not weeks." "Months?" Queen Evangeline's voice was faint. "How do we explain months of absence?" Adrian realized that they had reached the point he had been anticipating and dreading. The traditional royal approach had failed completely. Isabel could no longer maintain the facade that everything was fine, and continuing to try would only make her condition worse. "We tell the truth," Adrian said quietly. All eyes turned toward him. King Maximilian's expression was thunderous, but Adrian continued before his father could object. "Not the sensationalized version that the media wants, but our truth. We explain that Isabel is dealing with mental health challenges that many people face. We show that seeking professional help is responsible and brave. We demonstrate that the royal family is committed to health and well-being, not just maintaining appearances." Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly. From a medical perspective, Prince Adrian's suggestion makes complete sense. Continuing to hide Princess Isabel's condition while forcing her to perform public duties could cause permanent psychological damage. King Maximilian looked between his son and the doctor, his expression cycling through anger, fear, and something that might have been resignation. "You want to announce to the world that the royal family has mental health problems?" "I want to announce that the royal family takes mental health seriously," Adrian corrected. "That we understand it's a real medical issue that deserves professional treatment and public support, not shame and secrecy." The debate that followed was intense and emotional. Queen Evangeline worried about the impact on Isabel's future prospects and the family's reputation. King Maximilian expressed concerns about setting precedents that might encourage public intrusion into their private lives. But Adrian could see that both parents were beginning to understand that their options were limited. The turning point came when Isabel herself, having overheard parts of their conversation, appeared in the doorway. She was dressed in a simple robe, her hair uncombed, looking nothing like the polished princess the public expected to see. But her eyes were clearer than they had been in weeks. "I've been thinking about what Adrian said yesterday," she began, her voice stronger than anyone expected. "About telling our own story before others tell it for us. I want people to know that depression doesn't mean I'm weak or unfit for royal duties. It means I'm human, and I'm brave enough to get help." The room fell silent as Isabel continued. "If speaking honestly about my struggles helps even one person understand that mental health challenges are nothing to be ashamed of, then maybe that's more valuable than maintaining the illusion that royal blood makes us immune to normal human problems." Adrian felt a surge of pride and love for his sister. Even in her most vulnerable state, she was thinking about how her experience might help others. It was exactly the kind of leadership that the monarchy needed to demonstrate. King Maximilian sat heavily in his chair, looking older than his 62 years. "If we do this," he said slowly, "there's no going back. Once we open this door, we can never close it again. Maybe that's not a bad thing, Adrian replied gently. Maybe the door should have been opened years ago. Queen Evangeline moved to sit beside Isabel, taking her daughter's hand. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. It can't be a defensive reaction to media pressure. It has to be thoughtful and purposeful. Adrian nodded, his mind already working on the possibilities. We control the narrative. We choose how to frame the conversation. We make it about healing and hope, not crisis and failure. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. If I may suggest, there are excellent examples of how to discuss mental health issues publicly in ways that are both honest and constructive. The key is focusing on the recovery process and the positive message about seeking help. As the family continued to discuss possibilities, Adrian felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. The conversation was difficult and sometimes painful, but it was also genuine in a way that their family interactions hadn't been for years. They were finally talking about real problems with the possibility of real solutions. That afternoon, Adrian made another call to Dr. Mitchell. This time, instead of seeking personal guidance, he asked for her professional advice about how to approach public discussion of mental health issues in a way that would be helpful rather than harmful. The most important thing, she explained, is to focus on the positive aspects. Talk about the courage it takes to seek help, the effectiveness of treatment, the hope for recovery. Make it clear that mental health challenges are medical issues, not character flaws. What about the impact on the monarchy as an institution? Adrian asked. Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. In my experience, institutions that evolve to meet changing social needs tend to become stronger, not weaker. Young people today are much more aware of mental health issues than previous generations. They might actually respect a royal family that demonstrates emotional intelligence and authentic leadership. The idea was radical but compelling. Instead of damaging the monarchy, honest discussion of mental health might actually modernize it and make it more relevant to contemporary society. As evening approached, Adrian found himself once again in the palace garden, where he and Isabel had shared their honest conversation days earlier. This time, both his parents joined them, and for the first time in months, they talked openly about their fears, hopes, and concerns. King Maximilian admitted that his memory issues were becoming more frequent and more concerning. Queen Evangeline acknowledged that the stress of maintaining perfect appearances was affecting her own mental and physical health. Isabel spoke about her depression with newfound clarity and determination to recover. If we're going to change how this family deals with personal struggles, Adrian said as the sun set behind the palace walls, then we all need to be committed to that change, not just in public but in private too. The agreement was tentative, but real. For the first time, the House of Ravencrest was considering the possibility that honesty might be more powerful than perfection, that vulnerability might be a form of strength rather than weakness. As they walked back toward the palace together, Adrian realized that they had crossed a threshold. The decision to speak publicly about their struggles was no longer a question of if, but when and how. The next phase would require careful planning, professional guidance, and tremendous courage. But the foundation had been laid. The traditional approach that had guided the royal family for centuries was about to give way to something unprecedented. A monarchy that led through authenticity rather than illusion, that demonstrated healing rather than hiding pain, that showed the world that true strength comes from facing difficulties honestly rather than pretending they don't exist. Adrian knew that the path ahead would be challenging and uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. 3 weeks after that pivotal family conversation in the garden, Prince Adrian sat in a comfortable studio across from renowned television journalist Margaret Thornton. The decision to speak publicly about his family's struggles had been made carefully, with extensive consultation from mental health professionals, communications experts, and trusted advisors. The interview had been scheduled during prime time on the most respected news program in the kingdom. Margaret Thornton was known for her thoughtful approach to sensitive topics, her ability to ask difficult questions while maintaining appropriate respect for her subjects. Adrian had specifically chosen her because he wanted this conversation to be substantive rather than sensational. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret began, her voice warm but professional. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview. I know this must be a difficult decision for you and your family." Adrian nodded, feeling surprisingly calm despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "It was a difficult decision, Margaret. But ultimately we realized that silence was no longer an option, not just for our family's well-being, but for the people we serve who might be struggling with similar challenges." The questions that followed were exactly what Adrian had expected. Margaret asked about Isabel's condition, about the family's approach to mental health, about the decision to seek professional help. Adrian answered each question honestly but thoughtfully, focusing on the positive aspects of their journey toward healing. "Princess Isabel is dealing with depression and anxiety," he explained. "These are medical conditions that affect millions of people around the world, including members of royal families. The difference is that we have resources and support systems that many others don't. And we believe that gives us a responsibility to speak openly about the importance of mental health care." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Some people might say that revealing these personal struggles undermines the dignity and stability that the monarchy is supposed to represent." Adrian had anticipated this question and had thought carefully about his response. "I would argue that true dignity comes from facing challenges honestly rather than hiding them. True stability comes from addressing problems rather than pretending they don't exist. The monarchy's strength should come from our ability to demonstrate wisdom, compassion, and genuine leadership, not from maintaining an illusion of perfection." The most powerful moment of the interview came when Margaret asked about the impact on the royal family's relationships. Adrian's response was unscripted and deeply personal. "This crisis has actually brought us closer together as a family," he said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "For years we were all struggling privately while trying to maintain perfect public faces. Now we're supporting each other through recovery and healing. We're learning that vulnerability can be a form of strength, that asking for help is a sign of wisdom rather than weakness." Margaret asked about his father's reaction to this new approach. Adrian smiled slightly, remembering the gradual but significant changes in King Maximilian's perspective. "My father comes from a generation that was taught to handle personal difficulties privately," Adrian explained, "but he's seen how the traditional approach was affecting our family, particularly Isabel. He's learned that protecting the monarchy sometimes means evolving its practices rather than simply maintaining old traditions." The interview concluded with Adrian's vision for the future of royal leadership. "We want to show that modern monarchy can be both dignified and authentic, both traditional and progressive. We can honor our heritage while also demonstrating the values that matter most to people today: honesty, compassion, and the courage to seek help when it's needed." As the cameras stopped rolling, Adrian felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The words had been spoken, the decision made public. There was no going back now, only moving forward with the consequences of their choice. The response was immediate and intense. Within hours of the interview's broadcast, social media was flooded with reactions ranging from overwhelming support to harsh criticism. Traditional supporters of the monarchy expressed concern that the royal family had diminished their mystique and authority. But these voices were increasingly outnumbered by people praising the courage and authenticity of Adrian's words. Mental health organizations across the kingdom issued statements of support and gratitude. The National Depression Association reported that their helpline had received more calls in the 24 hours following the interview than in any previous week. Young people, in particular, responded with enthusiasm to a royal family that seemed genuinely relatable and emotionally intelligent. International reaction was equally divided, but ultimately more positive than negative. Other royal families watched carefully to see how the House of Ravencrest's experiment would unfold. Progressive politicians praised their courage, while conservative commentators worried about the precedent being set. Back at Ravencrest Palace, the family gathered to watch the interview together for the first time. Isabel, who had been too anxious to watch it live, sat between her parents as Adrian's words filled the elegant sitting room. "You did beautifully," she told her brother afterward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You said everything I wanted to say but couldn't find the courage for—" King Maximilian was quieter in his response, but Adrian could see the pride in his father's eyes. The king, who had spent his entire life protecting the monarchy through tradition and reserve, was slowly learning to see protection through evolution and authenticity. "The early response seems positive," Queen Evangeline observed, scrolling through carefully curated reports from the palace communications team. "People are calling it brave and refreshing." But Adrian knew that public opinion would continue to shift and evolve over the coming weeks and months. The real test would be whether their new approach to royal leadership would prove effective over time. The immediate practical changes were significant. Isabel began intensive therapy with Dr. Mitchell, who had agreed to work with the royal family on an ongoing basis. For the first time in months, she had a structured treatment plan that didn't require her to pretend she was fine while she was clearly struggling. King Maximilian, inspired by his children's courage, agreed to see a specialist about his memory concerns. The diagnosis was early-stage cognitive decline, treatable with medication and lifestyle changes, but requiring ongoing monitoring. Instead of hiding this development, the family made a measured announcement explaining that the king was dealing with a common condition and was receiving excellent care. Queen Evangeline began working with a therapist who specialized in helping public figures manage the stress and anxiety that came with constant scrutiny. For the first time in years, she had permission to acknowledge that royal life could be emotionally difficult rather than constantly maintaining that it was a privilege without challenges. Adrian himself continued his sessions with Dr. Mitchell, learning to separate his personal well-being from his royal duties in healthy ways. The sessions helped him understand that taking care of his own mental health was not selfish, but essential for effective leadership. The palace's approach to royal duties began to evolve as well. Instead of maintaining packed schedules regardless of personal circumstances, they built in flexibility for rest and recovery. Public events were planned with consideration for their mental and emotional impact, not just their political or ceremonial importance. 3 months after the interview, Isabel made her first public appearance since her crisis. She spoke at a mental health awareness conference, sharing her experience with recovery and encouraging others to seek help when needed. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people commenting that they had never felt more connected to or proud of their royal family. "I want people to know that having depression doesn't disqualify you from living a meaningful life or serving others," Isabel told the audience. "It's a medical condition that requires treatment, just like diabetes or heart disease. With proper care and support, people with mental health challenges can do extraordinary things." The audience's standing ovation lasted several minutes, and by the end of the week, Isabel had received thousands of letters from people sharing their own stories and thanking her for her courage. King Maximilian's approach to his own condition became another example of the family's new philosophy. Rather than hiding his cognitive challenges, he spoke openly about them while demonstrating that they didn't prevent him from continuing to serve effectively with proper support and accommodations. "Getting older brings certain challenges," he said in a rare public statement. The key is to acknowledge these challenges honestly and address them responsibly, rather than pretending they don't exist. The monarchy's approval ratings, which had declined during the months of speculation and uncertainty, began to climb steadily. Public opinion polls showed that younger citizens, in particular, felt more positive about the royal family than they had in years. The phrases authentic leadership and royal courage began appearing regularly in media coverage. International observers took note as well. The House of Ravencrest's approach began to influence discussions about modern monarchy around the world. Other royal families started considering how they might balance tradition with transparency, dignity with authenticity. Dr. Mitchell, reflecting on her work with the family 6 months after Adrian's initial contact, noted the dramatic positive changes in everyone's well-being. They've learned that healthy families can serve their communities more effectively than families that are struggling in secret, she observed. Their willingness to seek help and speak honestly about their challenges has actually strengthened their ability to provide leadership and inspiration to others. The transformation wasn't without ongoing challenges. There were still critics who felt that the royal family had compromised their mystique and authority. Some traditional supporters worried that too much openness might make the monarchy seem ordinary rather than special. But Adrian had learned to view these concerns as part of a necessary evolution. "The choice isn't between being perfect and being ordinary," he explained to his father during one of their regular conversations about the family's new direction. "The choice is between being authentic and being irrelevant." King Maximilian, who had initially been the most resistant to change, had become one of its strongest advocates. "I spent decades believing that strength meant never showing weakness," he admitted. "But watching our family heal and grow closer through this process has taught me that real strength comes from facing difficulties together and supporting each other through them." A year after Adrian's groundbreaking interview, the palace announced another first. They would be hosting an annual mental health symposium, bringing together experts, advocates, and citizens to discuss mental health care and reduce stigma. The event would be attended by the entire royal family and would feature personal stories of recovery and resilience. Isabel, who had become an unofficial spokesperson for mental health awareness, was particularly excited about this initiative. "We want to use our platform to continue these important conversations," she explained to the organizing committee. "Mental health affects everyone, regardless of their background or circumstances. The more we talk about it openly, the more we can help people understand that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness." The symposium's success exceeded all expectations. Attendees included everyone from teenagers dealing with anxiety to elderly citizens managing depression to public figures sharing their own experiences with mental health challenges. The royal family participated not as distant ceremonial figures, but as genuine contributors to important discussions about health and well-being. Adrian found himself thinking often about Dr. Mitchell's early observation that he had an opportunity to redefine royal leadership for the modern world. The experiment seemed to be working. The monarchy felt more relevant and connected to ordinary citizens' lives than it had in decades. The most meaningful measure of their success, however, was the change within the family itself. Regular family dinners had become occasions for genuine conversation rather than careful performance. They supported each other through ongoing challenges and celebrated each other's progress and achievements. Isabel's recovery continued steadily, with good days and difficult days, but an overall trajectory of improvement and growth. She had returned to most of her royal duties, but with a schedule that prioritized her well-being and allowed time for the therapy and self-care that kept her healthy. King Maximilian had adapted well to managing his cognitive changes with professional support and family understanding. Rather than struggling alone with his concerns, he had a team of medical experts and family members helping him navigate this new phase of his life with dignity and purpose. Queen Evangeline had discovered a sense of freedom in their new approach that she hadn't expected. No longer required to maintain a facade of perfection, she could focus her energy on the causes and activities that genuinely mattered to her, including advocacy for family mental health support. Adrian himself felt the profound relief that came with authentic living. The pressure to be perfect had been replaced with the challenge to be genuine, to lead through example rather than illusion, to demonstrate that vulnerability and strength could coexist in effective leadership. 2 years after his decision to speak publicly about his family's struggles, Adrian was invited to address the United Nations on World Mental Health Day. Standing before representatives from around the world, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. When my family decided to speak openly about our mental health challenges, we didn't know what the response would be, he told the assembled delegates. We only knew that continuing to suffer in silence was no longer acceptable, and that our position gave us an opportunity to help reduce the stigma that prevents so many people from seeking the help they need. He spoke about the importance of viewing mental health as an essential component of overall health, about the need for leaders at every level to model healthy approaches to stress and difficulty, about the responsibility that comes with platforms and privilege. The greatest service we can provide to our communities, Adrian concluded, is to demonstrate that seeking help is wise, that recovery is possible, and that our shared humanity includes both struggles and triumphs. When we lead with authenticity rather than perfection, we create space for others to be honest about their own challenges and to find the support they need to thrive. The speech was met with sustained applause and widespread media coverage. But for Adrian, the most meaningful response came in a letter from a young woman in his own kingdom who wrote that his family's openness had given her the courage to seek treatment for her own depression. "You showed me that mental health challenges don't make someone weak or unworthy," she wrote. "They just make someone human. Thank you for being brave enough to be human in public." Standing once again in the palace garden where so many important conversations had taken place, Adrian reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The roses still bloomed in their careful patterns. The ancient oak tree still provided shade for quiet contemplation, and the city of Valorian still spread beyond the palace walls. But the family that lived within those walls had been transformed. They faced the future with honesty rather than pretense, supported each other through authentic relationship rather than formal duty, and served their people through genuine connection rather than distant ceremony. The experiment in royal authenticity had succeeded beyond their most optimistic expectations. The House of Ravencrest had not only survived their decision to speak honestly about their struggles, they had become stronger, more relevant, and more beloved than ever before. As the sun set over the palace for another day, Adrian knew that there would be future challenges, new difficulties to navigate, and ongoing questions about how to balance tradition with progress. But he also knew that whatever came next, his family would face it together, honestly, and with the support they needed to thrive. The prince who had once feared that speaking about struggles would destroy the monarchy had instead discovered that authenticity could be its salvation. In learning to lead through vulnerability rather than perfection, the royal family had found a way to serve their people that was both ancient in its wisdom and thoroughly modern in its approach. The future of the House of Ravencrest had never looked brighter, precisely because they had been brave enough to acknowledge when it looked dark.